The night I met Elliot Voss, I had paint thinner on my hands and a granola bar in my pocket that I'd been saving since Tuesday. That was my life then. I was 31 years old, working as a textile conservator at the Smithsonian's Museum of American History in Washington, D.C., which sounds impressive until you explain what it actually means. That I spent my days in a basement, under fluorescent lights, repairing 200-year-old quilts and Revolutionary War uniforms that nobody would ever touch again. I didn't mind. I liked the quiet. I liked the way old fabric told you things without words, the way you could read a whole life in a single worn hem. I had a cat named Biscuit, who waited for me by the door every evening. I had a studio apartment in Adams Morgan with a radiator that clanked all winter. I had exactly zero interest in anything that required me to wear heels. So when the man in the charcoal suit appeared in the doorway of the conservation lab at 6:15 on a Thursday evening, I assumed he was lost. "We're closed to the public," I said without looking up. I was mid-stitch on a Continental Army coat, the kind of work that doesn't forgive interruption. "I'm not the public." His voice was the kind that expected rooms to go quiet. I looked up. He was tall, not in the way that people describe men in novels, but in the way that makes you aware of door frames. Dark hair, early 40s, a jaw that looked like it had an opinion about everything. He was wearing a watch that probably cost more than my annual salary. Behind him, half in the hallway, stood a man I assumed was a driver or an assistant. Quiet, deferential, eyes that swept corners. "Then what are you?" I asked. "Elliot Voss." He said it like that explained everything. It did not explain everything to me. I had heard the name, the way you hear names of people who exist in a different layer of the city. The fundraising galas, the newspaper columns, the whispered conversations at cocktail parties I was never invited to. Voss Industries, real estate, logistics, private security contracts. Old money that had learned how to dress as new money. That was the public version. What I didn't know then, what I couldn't have known, was everything underneath it. "How did you get in?" I asked. "I donated the East Wing renovation," he said, like that was a perfectly reasonable answer. I set down my needle. "What do you want, Mr. Voss?" He looked at me for a moment like he was calculating something. Not in a rude way. More like a man who was used to reading people quickly and was finding me harder to read than expected. "I need a favor," he said, "and I'm prepared to make it worth your while." I almost laughed. In my experience, when powerful men said that to women alone in basements, the correct response was to find the nearest exit. But something in his posture stopped me. He wasn't leaning in. He was standing very still, with the careful stillness of someone who knows that if they move too fast, they'll frighten something away. "My brother is getting married this weekend," he said. "Saturday. In Annapolis. I need a date." I stared at him. "You came to a museum basement to find a date." "I came to find you specifically." That landed differently. I didn't know what to do with it, so I put it down and stepped around it. "Why me?" He was quiet for a second. Not evasive. More like a man who'd rehearsed several answers and discarded all of them on the way here. "Because I need someone who isn't already part of this world," he said finally. "And because you were recommended by someone I trust." "Who?" "Patricia Hendricks." I blinked. Patricia was the museum's chief curator, my boss's boss, a woman so composed she made marble seem emotional. I could not imagine what chain of events had led to her recommending me for this particular task. "She said you were discreet," Elliot said, "and that you had excellent instincts for reading situations." "She said that about my conservation work. I know." I crossed my arms. Biscuit was going to be furious if I was late again. What exactly would this involve? 2 days in Annapolis, a wedding Saturday afternoon, a family dinner Friday evening. "I'd cover your expenses, your time, name a number that feels fair." He paused, "and I'd owe you a favor, genuinely. Not a hollow offer. I should have said no. Every reasonable instinct I had said no. But there was something in the way he said genuinely. Like the word cost him something. That made me pause 1 second too long. "Why can't you just go alone?" I asked. He looked at the window above my workbench, the one that showed a rectangle of gray evening sky. "Because there are people at this wedding who will interpret my being alone as vulnerability," he said quietly, "and I can't afford that right now." I thought about my Saturday. I thought about the granola bar in my pocket, and the radiator that clanked, and the quilt that had been waiting on my work table for 3 weeks because I kept getting distracted by smaller emergencies. "I'll need to bring my cat carrier," I said. "I'm not leaving Biscuit alone for 2 days." He blinked. It was the first time he looked anything other than composed. "Your cat. His name is Biscuit. He's anxious." A long pause. Fine. That was how it started. The drive to Annapolis Friday morning was quiet in the way that expensive cars make things quiet. Insulated, sealed off, the city sliding past the windows like it was happening to someone else. Biscuit sat in his carrier on the seat beside me and complained the entire way. Elliot sat in the front, his driver a compact, watchful man named Thomas, who had the energy of a retired military officer, navigated without being asked. I watched the back of Elliot's head and tried to piece together what I knew. Voss Industries had been in the news 2 years ago. Something about a federal contract dispute, something about a board shakeup. I hadn't followed it closely. I knew he had a brother named Adrian, who was marrying a woman from a Philadelphia family. Old names, old connections. I knew that weddings like this weren't really about love. They were about consolidation. What I didn't know was why I was nervous. I looked down at my outfit, a navy dress I'd borrowed from my friend Cleo, who had significantly more faith in me than I deserved, and heels that were already threatening to be a mistake. I looked at Biscuit. He looked back at me through the carrier mesh with the expression of a creature who had been personally wronged. "He'll be fine in the room," I said, more to myself than anyone. "I've arranged for him to have water and a litter box set up already," Elliot said, without turning around. I stared at the back of his head. "You arranged that. Thomas made some calls." Thomas caught my eye in the rearview mirror and gave me a look that said, "Please don't make a thing of this." I decided not to make a thing of it. The inn was exactly the kind of place that made you feel underdressed even in your best clothes. White clapboard, waterfront views, hydrangeas everywhere, the smell of money and old wood. Elliot checked us in with the efficient grace of a man who had done this many times, and I followed him to a suite on the second floor with 2 bedrooms, a sitting room, and a view of the harbor that made me forget, briefly, everything I was worried about. Biscuit emerged from his carrier, inspected the room with great suspicion, and then claimed a corner of the armchair as though he had always lived there. "Dinner is at 7, Elliot said from the doorway of the sitting room. "Jacket required, but nothing formal." "I'm aware of what jacket required means," I said. He almost smiled. It was barely a flicker, the kind of expression that told you there was a face behind the face he showed the world, and it was more interesting. "I should prepare you," he said, sitting down across from me, in the way that meant he was going to say something real. "My family is complicated. Most families are. Mine more than most." He looked at his hands briefly, then back up. "My brother Adrian is genuine. His fiancée Claire is. She's good. She's the reason I'm here. I wouldn't come back for most things, but I'd come back for her." He paused. "My uncle Raymond will be there." And that's the problem. It wasn't a question. I'd read enough subtext in 20 years of listening to people to know which name in a sentence carries the weight. "Raymond controls certain parts of our business interests that are disputed," Elliot said carefully. "He's brought people with him this weekend. People I don't recognize from the guest list I was given." I felt something shift in the room, something in the air pressure. "What kind of people?" "The kind who aren't here for the wedding." I looked at him. He looked back at me steadily, and I realized, with the particular clarity that comes when you stop pretending something is simpler than it is, that I was not here to be a date, or not only that. "You needed a witness," I said. "Someone credible, outside your world, who could be here without raising flags." "Patricia said you were perceptive." "Patricia should have told me what I was getting into." "You can leave," he said. It came out without defense. "Thomas will drive you back right now. You'll be compensated for your time. No questions." I looked at Biscuit, who was now asleep in the armchair with infuriating serenity. I thought about the studio apartment in Adams Morgan. I thought about all the small, quiet evenings that were perfectly fine and completely forgettable. "What do you need me to do?" I asked. The dinner was at a long table in the inn's private dining room. Ivory candles and silver frames, and the kind of floral arrangements that cost more than a car payment. I sat beside Elliot and tried to look like a woman who belonged there. Adrian, warm, laughing, with his brother's jaw and none of his stillness, pulled me into conversation within the first 5 minutes and made me feel like I'd known him for years. Claire was exactly as advertised. Grounded, funny, quietly sharp. She knew things about textile history, which almost made me cry with gratitude. Raymond was at the far end of the table. He was older than I expected. Late 60s, silver-haired, with the relaxed authority of a man who had never once in his life wondered if he was the most important person in the room. He looked at Elliot with a particular kind of smile, the kind that meant something had already been decided. Beside him sat 2 men I didn't recognize. They were introduced as business associates, names I didn't catch, cards I wasn't offered. They watched the table the way people watch things they're cataloging. I kept Elliot's wineglass full and touched his arm at the right moments, and asked Claire about her aunt's garden in Bryn Mawr, and the whole time I was counting. How many exits? Who was watching the door? Where Raymond's associates went when they excused themselves during the salad course and didn't come back for 20 minutes. We says goodnight. Elliot walked me upstairs and waited until we were inside the suite before he said anything. You're good at this, he said. I restore things for a living, I said. You learn to pay attention to what doesn't belong. The 2 men left during dinner and came back with mud on their shoes, he said. I noticed. So did I. He was quiet for a moment. There's a room at the end of the East Hall. It's not assigned to any guest. I need to know what's in it. You need to know. I can't go myself. Raymond's man is watching my floor. I thought about this. I was wearing Cleo's navy dress and heels that I had already taken off and was carrying in my hand. I was a textile conservator from Adams Morgan. I had a cat named Biscuit asleep in an armchair. Give me 10 minutes, I said. The east hallway was empty. I found the room. The Do Not Disturb sign hung at an odd angle, the kind of detail that meant someone had put it there in a hurry. I didn't touch the door. I didn't need to. On the floor outside, just at the threshold, was a fine dusting of plaster, and behind the door, barely audible, the sound of something electronic cycling through frequencies. Scanning equipment. Something was being monitored, or something was about to be transmitted. I was back in our suite in 8 minutes. They're not here for the wedding, I said. They're looking for something. Documents, maybe, or an account. Something you have that Raymond wants. Elliot's face did something I couldn't fully read. Not surprise. More like a confirmation of something he'd hoped he was wrong about. The Halford files, he said quietly, half to himself. What are those? He looked at me for a long moment. Then he sat down and told me. What he told me was not short, and none of it was comfortable. The version that mattered. Elliot had spent three years building a case against Raymond's subsidiary operations, not for personal gain, but because 2 men had died in a container yard in Baltimore that Raymond's logistics arm had been using to move things that weren't on any manifest. Elliot had the documentation. Raymond knew he had it. The files were stored in a way that required Elliot's biometric confirmation to access, and Raymond had apparently decided that this wedding weekend was an opportunity to find a leverage point. Something to trade. Someone to use. He's not going to find the files, Elliot said. He doesn't know that, I said, which means he's still going to try to get leverage. Yes. I thought about the men with mud on their shoes. I thought about the plaster dust at the door threshold. He's not just looking for files, I said slowly. He's setting something up. What happens if he can make it look like you did something this weekend? Something that discredits you before you can get the documentation to the people you're working with. The pause before he answered told me I was right. Who are you working with? I asked. That part I can't tell you. Federal? He said nothing. Okay, I said. Then here's what we do. I will not pretend I was calm for what came next. I want to be honest about that, because the versions of stories like this that women tell each other, there's usually a point where the narrator discovers she was secretly brave all along. I don't think that's quite right. I think I was scared and I did it anyway, which is a different thing, and I've come to believe the only kind of brave that actually counts. We moved through the inn like we were looking for a late-night snack. Thomas materialized from wherever Thomas materialized from and fell into step behind us. The east hallway was no longer empty. One of Raymond's men was stationed near the stairwell, which meant they'd escalated their timeline. The next 40 minutes are something I've told very few people, not because they're secret exactly, but because the sequence of it, the way a very normal evening became very not normal, is still hard to process in order. What I can say is this. Elliot got into the room before Raymond's man could reach the stairwell. Thomas had a quiet conversation with Raymond's associate in the hallway that ended with the associate sitting down heavily on a bench and staying there. I stood in the east hallway and told the second man, who came at us from the other direction, that I was a guest and I'd heard something in the walls and could he please help me find the front desk. It bought 4 minutes. 4 minutes was enough. What Elliot found in the room was a portable relay device, the kind used to broadcast as signals that would mirror communications and make them appear to originate from a different source. Raymond hadn't been trying to find Elliot's files. He'd been trying to make it look like Elliot was leaking them, frame the whistleblower. It was elegant if you had no conscience. The device stopped transmitting at 11:43 p.m. By midnight, Elliot had made 2 calls from the room, speaking in a way I recognized as careful and coded, to people who were clearly waiting to hear from him. By 12:30, we were back in the suite. Biscuit woke up briefly, registered that nothing interesting was happening, and went back to sleep. The wedding was at 2 o'clock Saturday afternoon, in the inn's garden, and it was beautiful. That's the part of this story that always catches me off guard when I think back on it. How beautiful it was. How entirely Adrian and Claire existed in their own world for those 2 hours. How none of the machinery of the night before left a visible mark on the afternoon. I sat beside Elliot in the second row and watched Adrian cry when he saw Claire walk down the aisle in a gown so simple it seemed impossible. And I thought about the way things can be real and complicated at the same time. How a wedding can be both a target and a genuine beginning. How the same family can contain Raymond and Adrian and still manage to produce an afternoon like this one. Elliot caught me looking at him at some point. I don't know when. I'd lost track of time, and he said very quietly, "Thank you. Not for the night before. Not for the relay device or the 4 minutes or the east hallway. For something else. For being there, I think. For making it look like he wasn't alone when it mattered." I didn't know what to say. So I said, "Biscuit is going to need to be fed by 4. He laughed. A real one, not the flicker from before. It changed his whole face. Raymond left before the reception ended. His associates were gone by the time the cake was cut. I watched them go from across the room and felt something unclench in my chest that I hadn't realized was clenched. At the reception, Adrian found me and hugged me like I was already family. "You're good for him," he said in my ear. "He smiles different." I didn't know what to do with that either. On the drive back to D.C. Sunday morning, Biscuit slept in his carrier with genuine contentment, which he never does in cars. The city came back gradually through the windows, the highway, the beltway, the familiar skyline that is never as dramatic as other cities but always, undeniably, home. "The people I called Friday night," Elliot said. "We were 20 minutes out from Adams Morgan. It's going to move quickly now. Raymond will know what happened by Monday." "And," I asked, "and it's over for him." He said it without satisfaction. That was one of the things I noticed. He never seemed to want this. He just seemed to know it had to be done. "The 2 men in Baltimore," I said. "Did they have families?" "Yes." He didn't look away. "That's why." I nodded and looked out the window. When Thomas pulled up in front of my building, Elliot got out and helped me with the carrier. We stood on the sidewalk in the thin Sunday morning light, Adams Morgan coming awake slowly around us. Coffee smells, a dog walker, someone's radio through an open window. "Name a number," he said. "For your time. For this weekend." "I'll think about it," I said. He handed me a card. Just his name and a number. No title, no address. "If you think of it," he said. I took it. I looked at it. I looked at him. "You said you'd owe me a favor," I said. "A real one." I did. "There's a piece in our collection," I said. "A Civil War-era quilt from a freedwoman's church in Georgia. We've had it for 6 years and we can't get the funding to do the full restoration. It's sitting in acid-free tissue in a storage drawer." I paused. "It should be on a wall somewhere. It should be seen." He looked at me for a long time. Then something in his face settled. "Send me the documentation Monday," he said. I picked up Biscuit's carrier and went inside. 6 weeks later, the quilt had a dedicated restoration grant and a promised exhibition slot at the National Museum of African American History and Culture, 18 months out. The announcement came on a Thursday afternoon. I was in the basement lab, under the fluorescent lights, mid-stitch, on a Continental Army coat. I set down my needle and sat there for a minute, just breathing. Elliot texted that same evening. 3 words. Did you see? I wrote back. I saw. He wrote back 1 minute later, 4 words this time. Dinner, Friday. Name somewhere. I looked at Biscuit. He was asleep in the laundry basket, which was his second favorite place, and he looked entirely unbothered by the future. I texted back an address. A small Eritrean place in Shaw that most people didn't know about, where the food was extraordinary, and the tables were close together, and nobody cared about watches that cost more than cars. He wrote back, perfect. And it was.